Thank you for your presence here today. We are going to go ahead and get started. So, today's session is on guiding principles, empowered social justice resources. And if you've been in the previous free informational webinars, you've seen me describe where this initial screen grab comes from. It's from a wonderful video from the 1950s, 1954, from the formerly great National Education Association called The Freedom to Learn. And this is something that's relevant to today's world. And we need to have a freedom to learn and viewpoint diversity in our classrooms so that we can have an opportunity to continue to uphold our democratic republic against forces and agitators who would like to seek to undermine our democratic republic and turn it into a communist system. So it's a different relevance today, but still relevant nonetheless. Students deserve the freedom to learn and to have critical thinking and viewpoint diversity in their curriculum, especially around the topic of social justice. So today we're speaking about the guiding principles. And I just want to kind of give an overview because some people may be just popping into today's session. Just so you know, the Empowered Social Justice Resources were published in April of 2024. At this time, it's been downloaded over 3,000 times, which I am very thankful for. And June 1st, we had our virtual launch event. And if you didn't see that, I encourage you to watch the virtual launch if you weren't able to view it or attend it. This is where I really just introduced the Empowered Social Justice Resources to people and got them to understand the different approaches to social justice that are in operation in our educational systems, K through 12 and higher ed. We had our first free informational summer workshop on June 26th. Thanks to all who attended on ideological subversion. Today, we're focusing in on guiding principles and what are the guiding principles of the Empowered Social Justice Resources and Framework. On the 24th of July, I'll be speaking specifically about the standards and resources that educators can use and that schools and districts can use in designing empowered social justice learning opportunities. And on the 7th, this is going to be a great session where I speak about ethnic studies and the importance of viewpoint diversity in the field of ethnic studies. And this will be something that our K through 12 and higher education colleagues will be interested in because ethnic studies has weaseled its way into not only K through 12, but higher education systems as well. And you'll understand that comment when you hear a little bit about the history at our August 7th meeting. So in today's meeting, I will be speaking about three topics. The first one is on liberalism and social justice. I'll speak about the guiding principles of the empowered social justice framework. And then I will speak on the road ahead and what lies next for us. As I am speaking, so this is an informational webinar, meaning that it's not interactive or, we're not having breakout rooms or things of that nature. I do offer those types of learning experiences for a fee. So this is a informational workshop today. And I encourage you to use the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar and to ask questions throughout. I'm thankful to have a moderator here helping me today, Rob, appreciating of that. We'll get to some Q&A after section C when I'll be turning it over to him. So first, let's speak about liberalism and social justice. And as you see, I have, different directions here and question marks because how we approach social justice. And if you missed our ideological subversion workshop, I strongly encourage you to check that out because I went into detail about these ideological subversion of the field of social justice, as well as the illiberal critical social justice approach that is the default in our K through 12 and higher education spaces, and far too many spaces. In fact, some of the proponents demand that their illiberal way of approaching the topic is the only way, or the quote, most authentic way, and all the other scare tactics and intimidation words that they use to stymie any kind of diversity of thought or viewpoint. So today, let's start off with speaking about liberalism and social justice briefly. Just reminding from our ideological subversion workshop, this is important to just state at the outset. And I really appreciate Helen Pluckrose for her work on this and helping people to understand what is critical social justice. As she refers to it, it is a gospel. It is something that cannot be questioned. It cannot be challenged. And these tenets of the gospel of critical social justice are accepted as true, accepted as unquestionable, and accepted as the gospel. It may not be questioned, it is the orthodoxy. So here are some of the key points of it, and it will help you to better understand why an alternative is so desperately needed to teaching social justice topics in any educational sector, K through 12 or higher ed. The first tenet of the gospel of critical social justice is that all white people are racist. Another tenet is that being non-racist isn't possible. A third tenet is that masculinity is pathological. A fourth tenet is that sex is not biological and exists on a spectrum. Another tenet is disbelief in the concept of gender identity is killing people. Another tenet is that language is literally violence. And finally, everything needs to be decolonized. So if you're seeing people, teachers, educators, administrators making statements, are alluding to, some of the terms and ideas and worldviews that you've seen expressed here, you're really hearing them express their fidelity to the gospel of critical social justice. And these are things that, according to the proponents and the ideologues who embrace this, must not be questioned, and that everyone must accept uncritically. And in an educational sphere, whenever someone's asked to accept something uncritically and not question it, that's a red flag for everybody. So when we think about liberalism and social justice and the very illiberal approach of critical social justice, which nonetheless has a right to exist and people have a right to believe in it, we see that liberalism has really worked by trying to remove social significance from identity categories like race, sex, and sexuality by appealing instead to individualism, pluralism, and universalism. And so that's why when we outlined in the previous workshop the differences between an illiberal approach to social justice, which would include liberated critical models, and a liberal approach to this topic. It's not about left or right or Republican or Democrat or any political parties. These are the values that are central to America and Americans. So let's take a look here about what am I meaning by those specific highlighted words. And again, thanks to Pluckrose. So individualism, in terms of this, someone working from a perspective that embraces liberalism over illiberalism believes that somebody's sex, race, gender, sexuality should not define or limit them to any particular role in society. Instead, people should be treated as individuals who should be able to pursue their own fulfillment and potential without barriers. So it's important we define the terms that we're using. So under the banner of liberalism, individualism is defined in this manner. In terms of universalism, liberalism believes in universality, which means we believe in the common humanity of all people and universal human rights, freedoms, and opportunities. And the final one was, oops, sorry, skipped over one, pluralism. Pluralism. Liberalism embraces a pluralistic concept of society in which it is okay and even positive if people differ in all sorts of ways, in which we can coexist and actually benefit from all of these different experiences and worldviews without one worldview or identity needing to be imposed on any group by the other or by members of the same group. So hopefully this is helping us better understand those three elements outlined there and why they're so important to social justice education and why we need to take a look at universalism, pluralism, and sorry, something froze here. Sorry about that. Sorry, it was individualism, pluralism, and universalism. Working on multiple screens, everybody. So, guiding principles, if you've had a chance to download the Empowered Social Justice resources, the guiding principles will be the first thing that you encounter in the document. And they're really important because it's really helping us to understand some things about the manner in which educators approach the topic of social justice in the classroom. And as I've outlined in the document, the guiding principles for the Empowered Social Justice resources were created to cultivate and foster liberal democratic values. And in order to do that, as educators, this involves us thinking about the ways that we think of the topic of social justice, the ways we feel about it, our attitudes, our beliefs, the things we say, and our practices. So that's something that's important for us to understand. What is the purpose of the guiding principles? It really is to outline those things. Teaching and learning does not take place in a vacuum. And whether you like them or not, because I've had some feedback from people who say, oh, none of this should be in the schools, period. We're going to make it DIE like DEI, and we're not going to have social justice in education. There's some people who believe that. And there are also some people who believe that it is important for us to speak of justice in education, whether it's social justice or some other form, and who will remain committed to speaking about those topics. So we have to find a middle ground and really recognize the reality of the situation. The reality is that concepts of racial justice, social justice, and so forth, critical social justice, are being incorporated into our US history, social studies, civics, ethnic studies, and interdisciplinary curricula for grades K through 12 and higher education. So this is not something that's unique to K through 12, even though the framework is intended to roll out in K through 12 and is. I'm so excited. But also is relevant to higher education because when our teachers are trained and educators are trained at teacher education programs, they're being taught that this should be central to the teaching of all disciplines and subjects. There is a strong commitment that is built up within teachers through their teacher education and training programs to teach from a social justice lens. Unfortunately, what's happened over time is that, as we outlined in our previous workshop, there's been ideological subversion of social justice writ large. And it has been overtaken by critical social justice ideologues who have literally pushed out and are actively pushing out anyone who does not bend a knee and stand and kneel in submission to the gospel of critical social justice. So these empowered social justice guiding principles are really intended to outline the essential attitudes and practices that are required to support educators in being reflective and intentional in their learning design efforts in order to cultivate and promote the liberal democratic values to the fullest. And these guiding principles are informed and inspired by the work of Jason Littlefield and his empowered humanity theory. And it outlines three essential attitudes that educators seek to develop and strengthen, and three practices that educators seek to embed in their classroom daily routines and habits. And so these attitudes and practices work together to help our educators who are wanting to work from an empowered social justice perspective, are seeking to embody and enact empowered social justice in their learning environments and instructional design processes, they have some principles to look to and some concrete examples of three attitudes and three practices that are encouraged to engage in. So let's start with the attitudes. Empowered social justice educator attitudes. One of them is a values centered identity. Another is a dignity lens. And a third is prioritizing mindsets of inquiry and compassion. So let's look at each one of the attitudes, and hopefully this will spur some reflection and questions. Do submit some questions to the Q&A because we will have time for that moderated Q&A at the end here at the closing. So welcoming and encouraging that. So let's dive into each of the attitudes. So the first is a value-centered identity. And what is this? This involves, as Littlefield describes, developing an identity rooted in self-selected values allows for growth over a lifetime. Filtering life through chosen values aligns one's thinking, feeling, and behavior with their true self. So when we're thinking of that, instead of having students, as we've outlined in the launch workshop, as well as in the previous workshop, instead of having students to think of themselves as their identity checkboxes and where those checkboxes lie on the matrix of domination and oppression, instead, you would encourage students to develop their identity through self-selected values. And these can change over time. So this is something that is really important for people to take a look at. One moment here. I'm going to pause here for a sec. Mm. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so here we go. I had to pause for a second there. Go ahead and resume my share. All right. Thanks for your patience there, everybody. Sometimes we have to make adjustments on the fly, right? That's awesome. So value-centered identity. How does that look when you are doing that through a lens of empowered social justice? Well, one thing that would be helpful, and that is very helpful, is to intentionally avoid perpetuating racialization, the reification of race, and the racial worldview as the only viable worldview. In many places, it's being taught that A, race is real, that B, it's important for us to focus on it, and that racism is everywhere and it's present in every interaction that humans have. That's the critical social justice ideological roots, shining through there. And this emphasis that we have our students from kindergarten, starting in kindergarten onward, start to identify themselves with a race other than the human race, and to, identify their peers in that way and to name and use those terms with each other. That is reification of race. And so intentionally avoiding perpetuating racialization, the reification of race, and the racial worldview as the only viable view. That's when we say race is a social construct, and that's it. And no one's allowed to question that. And we all accept that. And we move to the next gospel or precept. So, another thing that social justice educators do when using these guiding principles of a value centered identity is to develop and use learning activities that provide space for individual students to develop their personal identities that are rooted in self selected values and that express their individual personalities. And as educators, we realize that humans are more than their race and gender identity checkboxes. The second attitude is a dignity lens. And let's just look at how Littlefield defines this. It's cultivating a perspective that places human dignity at the forefront of interpersonal and relational interactions. It decreases the innate capacity for prejudice and the propensity for categorical and dehumanizing thinking and strengthens trusting relationships. So, viewing things through a dignity lens would be an attitude that is centered in the guiding principles of the empowered social justice framework. And what does that mean? That means that educators working from this perspective cultivate respectful and inclusive learning environments that recognize that not every individual subscribes to race normative or gender identity normative ways of self identification or to the practice of identifying others in racialized or gender identity informed manners. This is really important when we talk about uplifting the dignity of each student in the communities that we serve, that we not make assumptions about our students and the way that they view the world or the way they should view the world if someone's working from that perspective and tempting to, indoctrinate folks into the way they think. But I just think it's so important that we do recognize as educators that not every person subscribes to that worldview or that way of thinking about their fellow humans, nor should they have to. And nor should they have to engage in practices that are embedded in the classroom, in the flow of the lesson, in the flow of the information by the teacher. So this is a educator directly controlling the navigation and how things flow in the room. If you're having each other identify as in their racialized forms or gender identity format it matters or whatever categorization or box is being used, it's problematic for many ways, not just the critical thinking aspects. All right. And then the third attitude is prioritizing mindsets of inquiry and compassion. And let's hear from Littlefield. What is that? It's prioritizing attitudes of inquiry and compassion over those of fear and judgment. And it allows for improved problem solving and the easing of suffering. And so there's many ways that you can do this, but just one overarching thing to keep in mind in terms of the guiding principles and how does that look in practice. Empowered social justice educators take responsibility for selecting primary and secondary sources that provide opportunities for comparative analysis between diverse viewpoints. For example, those that do and do not reify race or promulgate a racial worldview. So these are important to keep in mind, important things to keep in mind as we improve our craft as educators and things that are important when seeking to enact a more empowered approach to social justice topics in the classroom. So when we think about attitudes, of course, those are married with practices. And so some of the things that are focused on, again, borrowing from Littlefield's empowered humanity theory framework, are practices that build equanimity and awareness, practices that celebrate our common humanity, and practices that build compassion for self and others. And so I do want to take a look into those. So the practices that build awareness and equanimity. First, a little bit of definition again here. So these practices promote insight into ourselves, each other, and the world around us. Mindfulness, in particular, is a practice that builds awareness and equanimity, enabling us to find calm during moments of chaos. So, empowered social justice educators intentionally embed reflective and holistic learning design in their daily classroom practices. How are we centering, those ways of being in connection with my internal dialogue, with myself, with my peers, and finding that those moments of calm, as was mentioned, and getting insight into ourselves, one another, the world at large, that systems thinking understanding of human development that we talked about in the launch workshop is something to take a look into. So, how might that look, or what are some things to keep in mind? Um, Really intentionally embedding reflective and holistic learning design in the daily practice, not just some of the time, but all of the time. And that's something that really helps in terms of building a humanity focus and empowered learning environment. The second practice would be practices that build kindness and compassion for the self and others. And let's hear the definition from Littlefield. These practices encompass encouraging and positive gestures, words, and acts of service extended without intentions or expectations. They also involve acknowledging and actively seeking to alleviate suffering, whether it's one's own or another's. And so, how does that look, or what are some things to keep in mind? Just emphasizing the interconnectedness between all human beings, promoting service to others as a mean to increase fairness, goodwill, better friendship, and beneficence to all involved or concerned. So, just keeping in mind those aspects. And then finally, in terms of practices that are engaged in, celebrating our common humanity. And this is something that we don't do enough. But let's look at what Littlefield says. These practices highlight the similarities between people. Sharing stories and identifying elements of oneself within others are examples of practices that celebrate our common humanity. And something important to note here, and this is a biggie, um, is that when you're working from an empowered perspective, inviting, encouraging, have the moral courage and the just basic courage to eschew any kind of pedagogical practices that encourage students to define themselves or others by race, gender identity, or other identity checkboxes. And specifically on this, the unproven constructs like I would add implicit bias, intersectionality, um, but intersectionality in particular, because it ignores human agency and free will and instead focuses on fatalistic and deterministic identity checkboxes that are assumed to relate to matrices of privilege and oppression. So that's how it's being used at this time. And that version of intersectionality is one that I strongly encourage anyone working from an empowered social justice perspective to really just stay away from and to take care with when you see it in use. Because really just think about the impacts, regardless of the intent, right, of this kind of approach, of telling kindergartners and first graders and second graders to look at each other through these identity check boxes, telling them that, some of their relatives have oppressed people, and that, maybe they are oppressors and are victims. No, avoided in the teaching and learning process. Humans are more than their identity based check boxes. If I could do a 100 with my body, I'll look into some eurythmy. Okay. So, this is what we're talking about, guiding principles that foster liberal democratic values. And it is critical that we are thinking not only of, the attitudes that we hold, what's in our heart, what we form in our mind and our worldviews that we express, and those do come out in the things we say and do. So that's why it's important to have some grounding principles that you're able to anchor, the curriculum and the way that you're approaching it in. Of course, each teacher has their own like teaching philosophy, and so it's designed to be a more meta level thing that you can use and access and hopefully help better serve our students. So let's wrap things up with the road ahead. Again, encouraging you all to ask me some questions in the Q&A, or it's open there. I think you click on the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar. Yes. Okay. So really just wrapping this up, it's about a choice, and it is a choice. It should be a choice. In the present dominance of the critical social justice ideologues, it isn't a choice in many places. And if you dare to question or speak about it or ask, interrogate the gospel, or, ask questions about it, it can get you a lost job, lost friends, a loss of many things. But the solution to that is not to just cower and to go along with, because you are literally having an impact on future generations here. So it's important to understand that education is one of our most important responsibilities. I'm a little biased as a lifelong educator, um, but I just think we need to pay attention to the ideologies that are at play. They're making themselves very well known through their deeds and actions, and even just the perspectives that are being seen throughout the world. And I like that, I appreciate that, but I think we do have a lot of work to do ahead, because we're going to need to be, as more people start to speak and become informed about these various ideologies and how they're operating, and they start to ask more questions and try to see more and hear more from people about what they mean when they say things like social justice. It's important that we know one choice, which is the critical social justice choice, leads us to equity, or the equal outcomes in every meaning of the word, in every sense of the word. That is what social justice is considered under a critical social justice framework. And under a classical social justice framework, which is rooted in liberal democratic values, there would be an emphasis on equality of opportunity as the outcome that's being sought. And this is like the large outcome. There's many, right? So keep that in mind as we move ahead. And just a reminder, I always like to touch back into these things in each opportunity I have to give information to people, because sometimes when you hear certain terms, especially the way our media, which is an ideological apparatus, I mean, it's at this point, um, has really gone into the language of critical social justice ideology, has really pushed the gospel. It's been one of the strongest proponents, and I'm talking on television and print, both. And so it's really unfortunate to see, but people really don't know what liberal values are, what liberal democratic values are. They don't know about why it's important that we live in a democratic republic. They don't know, they haven't been taught, and in many cases have been intentionally mistaught to align with the narrative that critical social justice ideology has been successfully enacting upon. I mean, there's lots of work here, at least a generate two generations, right? This has been at work for some time. And so anyways, liberal values, and I put in the center intentionally democracy, the separation of church and state, limited government, universal human rights, respect for the value of differing opinions and honest debate, freedom of expression, and equality for women, racial minorities, and LGBT people. So these are things that are central to it. So when we say that we're seeking to, embody and enact liberal values, that would be something that we would be looking at under empowered social justice approach. And then two, just thinking in terms of the American context, in terms of the use of democratic, because that's also been subverted, and means something completely different to some. But liberal democratic values in the American context involve things like free and fair elections, the right to private property, respect for individual rights and fundamental freedoms, a pluralistic system of political parties and organizations, truly pluralistic, equality before the law, consent of the governed, and the independence of the branches of government. And again, if these things aren't being taught in our schools, but instead students are being taught to be activists, that's when we find ourselves in the situation we find ourselves. So liberalism matters. And I again want to emphasize this is not a left or right thing. This is not a Republican, a Democrat, or Libertarian, or Green Party, or whatever thing. This is an American thing. And so liberalism is something that is central, and liberal democratic values are central to America as a society. And if you're seeking to dismantle and destroy that, then of course the ideas of empowered social justice are just odious. Okay, and that's okay. And it should work the same the other way, but unfortunately it doesn't. And we need the mob behavior and the bullying and the intimidation and the silencing and the shunning and, all of it to just stop, because that's stopping progress for all of us. So importantly, liberals on either side of the political spectrum may disagree on economic issues and other issues of policy, but they are united in their support for individual liberty, common humanity, freedom of belief and speech, the value of viewpoint diversity, and the need for consistent principles in which the same rules and freedoms apply to everyone. So I really strongly encourage folks, pick up Helen Pluckrose's book, The Counterweight Handbook, Principal Strategies for Surviving and Defeating Critical Social Justice at Work, in Schools, and Beyond. Really great templates for letter writing about issues like pronouns and so forth, ethnic studies, liberal practices like racialized affinity groups, and other things like that. So check it out. It's a great resource. I just wanted to put that in there in case folks aren't looking down to the source. And then two, just reminding that the Empowered Social Justice Resource has many components. There's the guiding principles, which we've talked about today. And these are the educator attitudes and practices for empowered social justice. In our next session, we are going to be talking about the standards. And then we'll also look at ethnic studies and teaching ethnic studies. Don't miss that one. And then touchstone texts that are used in empowered social justice resources and that are strongly suggested in order to know about liberal democratic values. Go to some of the sources like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, American Convention on Human Rights, so forth. If you're going to speak about race, really teach about racial classification and the contested nature and history of it in America. Couple of books to check out, and I strongly encourage both educators, and if you are teaching about it, then your students will be ready to learn these concepts as well. And then two, in terms of when speaking about race, I'm just listing three ideologies that seem to be the most dominant ones in most places. One, the anti-racist, then colorblind, and then the raceless ideology. So I encourage, if you're going to speak about race and engage students in that you're engaging them in the various ideologies and then viewing things through a comparative lens of these different ideologies. Because surprise, many of their peers and the people they know and people in their communities and maybe their parishioners and maybe their reverends and maybe their, everyone who surrounds them, if they have been locked into this critical social justice ideology and way of viewing race and centralizing it to everything and essentializing, it's important that we understand the way that different people think and that they view things. That creates better relations when we're able to better understand the different ways that people and the world views that people are using and putting into practice and policy. So important to look at that. If we're engaging on these high level topics, we have to do some high level work. And if we're going to do real history, and talk about authentic things, then we need to be embracing viewpoint diversity and knowing that there isn't just one way, and there nor should there be one way to view these topics, and that there are multiple ways, and that students have the agency and the free will to say what resonates best with them, and they should feel comfortable to be able to do that wherever they are. So when we talk about that and getting these things into practice, there are some resources that I encourage folks, to take a look at in the Empowered Social Justice resources, and also lesson and unit plans. Really, there's no one way to teach empowered social justice. So really just pointing you to places, and building with the community. There's a spot where you can submit different suggestions as well. So check those out. And then two, just as we look ahead and I wrap up here with my comments, we have started a journey on June 1st. That was the launch event. And then we're having these free informational summer workshops. And the first one was on ideological subversion and really helping people understand how that works and is working in the field of social justice education. Today, we talked about the guiding principles. Then I'll be speaking about on the 24th, the standards and the resources. And then finally, on August 7th, wrapping up with teaching ethnic studies. And I do also offer customized workshops and consultations, and you can check those out on drtlee.com if you want to take deeper dives or things of that nature. So I think, yes, that is wrapping up my remarks. I do want to note that this is an independent effort, and so I do appreciate and support investors' philanthropic support. I am a small team of one or, maybe a few others. I hear from one person at least today. Um, but my work is independent work through my independent educational consultancy. So encourage folks to make a donation to keep that going. And the vision here from these informational workshops, these will also be resources in a open source, like open, available to all, open access course on empowered social justice resources, so that people can get them on demand and be able to have them as a resource. So at this point, I'd like to welcome on my friend Rob to see if we have any questions or, yeah, that's it. Questions? I'll mute my mic.
Thanks, Dr. Lee. We do have some questions here, and thanks again for your talk, as always. So first, I'd like to ask, it says, thank you, Dr. Lee, for providing this opportunity of learning. I remember reading a sociology journal where the journal writer warns sociologists and psychologists to stop reifying socially constructed identities by threatening them as real. I work in healthcare, and it is scary to see how medical practitioners weave in racial categories as some form of tangible factor that can inform making a medical diagnosis. How can we change the value of our health institutions' place in reifying such categories?
This is a very meaty question, and dealing with medical education, which this is relevant too, because critical social justice ideology finds its way into everything, and has found its way into everything, pretty much. Civic organizations, religious, non-religious organizations, secular organizations, just every kind of community organizations, our medical field and medical training and curriculum, which is, I believe this person is alluding to. And how can we, what's the question? Can you repeat the last part of it?
Yes, it's how can we change the value of our health institutions' place in reifying such categories?
Yeah, so this is coming through the educational experience and learning and training of our medical professionals. And so one thing to do is to start to, as boards of trustees and others, chairs, so-called educational leaders who are in the upper structure, the massive administrations on many campuses. It's important to start having those people be accountable for the things that are being taught and emphasized over medical competency or educational, competency or any other kind of, you know, um, learning goal. And so I think it's important for people to start overlooking that, not overlooking it, but having oversight over that, and to demand accountability from the leaders in those settings, who are approving the budgets, who are approving the material, and then shaping the learning experiences as well. And the teacher unions, are one group to really contest with, because many of them have been ideologically captured. And it's so saddening to see. It's not every member protected. It's the members who aspire, who believe in and will profess without question, zero question, because it's the truth, the gospel of critical social justice. And so that's a dangerous place to be in, and to have that kind of mentality and communication style engaged in, and just the shutting out of any other kind of way of thinking. And that's why I appreciate things like the empowered social justice guiding principles, because it really is encouraging attitudes and practices that will begin to heal and move beyond, and just help us to really realize and manifest equality of opportunity, and focus on that instead of being unfocused on a whole bunch of other stuff that's actually the way it's being done. And I'm talking about methods and pedagogy and the discourse around it. It's not healthy. It's very toxic. So just encouraging that embracement of um, the principles that are outlined in the empowered humanity theory, and having those be an inspiration as ways to approach the topic at the start, and then of course we get into the standards and all that other fun stuff and teaching ethnic studies. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Another question here. Are there any resources for more authentic or objective definitions of anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion? My district is preparing to implement DEI anti-racism initiatives, and the Academic Senate is responsible for enforcing these new mandates from the California Chancellor's Office. There is interest in creating a glossary of terms that are not based on critical social justice. The goal is to implement the DEI anti-racism mandate in a way that does not violate the academic freedom of faculty.
Oh, I was sorry, I was laughing there. The goal is to do that. Okay. Was there a question in there, or was
I believe it's just a commentary.
Oh,
No, the question is, are there any resources for more authentic or objective definitions of anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion?
yes, yes. I would encourage that individual to check out the references list in the Empowered Social Justice resources. There are several authors there that you could take a look at, in terms of defining the different words and terms, and competing definitions are even probably, not probably, but are included in there, because it gets into the work of the different anti-racist scholars and the colorblind scholars and the raceless scholars. So that's a good place to start as a resource. But you could probably just do some search terms too, We have these great AI tools now that can help us to even get some comparison of ideas and ways of thinking about and defining certain terms. And I think it's important when people say authentic, I start to think like, oh, here comes the orthodoxy, because everybody's recipe is authentic. And so let's just keep that in mind and embrace some pluralism and welcome it. And in terms of objective pluralism, keeping that open inquiry is going to be really important. And having access to different ideas, competing ideas, a well-rounded a number of perspectives is something that's so crucial to teaching and learning, especially on these social justice topics. So that's how I would encourage that. Now, when you work in a system that seeks to impose from the top down its own vision of what should be, that that is something that you need to just be aware of. If you're working in that type of system, something allowed it to get that way. And likely it was a whole lot of lack of moral courage, and people just willing to be what they're there to be, especially as a professor. Um, so those are things that I would point out, and hope people would remember, and emphasize in terms of, how did we get here? And then now, what do we need to do to restore even what it says in the master plan for California's master plan for education and the role of certain institutions in that? So that's how I relate it to I don't know if that person's from here or from California.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lee. On to the next question here. My question regards political pressures from teachers' unions, which overwhelmingly favor liberated ES and Palestine narratives, as well as legislative caucuses, which insist that ethnic studies should include biased political narratives that are anti-Semitic. The California legislator is trying to formulate more effective guardrails for AB 101 ethnic studies, but pressure groups like Teachers Union and CARE are objecting. Then additionally, from the same commenter question, what can the public do to influence this process?
Yes, there's a lot that the public can do and should do in terms of connecting with their elected officials, and expressing, how they feel. Because one thing that the critical liberated proponents have really been able to do is to lobby, is to organize, is to, stay engaged, is to wage a revolution. So that's what's been and continues. And hi, anybody, how you doing? Um, that's good and that's fine and that's their right to do. But why can't also exist and coexist next to these suggested policies, because that's what they are. No matter how much I saw something recently where the critic it was the Liberated Ethnic Studies cohort, coalition rather, and in their principles they talk about how their way of teaching, the critical liberated way, is the authentic way, and any other way is not what it was meant to be. It's not what the originators meant it to be. And so I really hope folks will tune in to the Teach Ethnic Studies uh, workshop, informational workshop, because we'll be sharing some things. And I think it's important for people to understand the history. You must understand the history. And that's part of that opening slide. When the social studies teacher in that film was accused of teaching her students about communism, and it was an outrage, and she was called into by administration because of leading people to danger and for talking about, even the construct. That's not freedom to learn. And so what we're really asking for is freedom to learn in a real way. And for those teachers unions that have been captured, who are not representing all members of all perspectives as vigorously as they can. If that's not the case, then there's a problem with those as well, and with the processes and what they've devolved into. And so I really think that it's important for the members to address that. And if you're paying dues, you're a member, um, whether you're invited to executive council or not. But yeah, so anyways, what I'm saying is get involved and be there and be present and be in the room, talk to your legislators, write letters, pick up Helen Pluckrose's book, The Counterweight Handbook. It's really just splendid, because often people say, like, I want to write a letter or something. Do you have any templates? And then this book came out. And so now I can be like, just check this book out, and how she really outlines some of the claims and different ways of navigating some of the complexities of the critical social justice ideology. So hopefully that's helpful for people, and being involved, staying involved, being present, and not just allowing, folks to make it so unpleasant by their unpleasant actions and reactions that you withdraw, because this is your community and your learning environment too. So that's what I would say to the people: just getting involved, writing the letters, being present at meetings, speaking out, and continuing to demand accountability and transparency.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Another person asks, how can I access the previous lecture, the launch, and the prior summer workshop?
Yes. If you, I'm just, oh, I should have paused this. Um, Scanning this QR code or going to the tiny URL // Dr. Lee ESJR, Empowered Social Justice Resources, is a way to access the launch video. And also, once the Evergreen on-demand course, free course is available, that will also be posted at that same link. So that's kind of just like a permalink to keep, and you can check out the prior video there. And once the other videos are incorporated, they'll be there too.
All right, thank you. And then I think we have time for one more question. Can you help us to think of ways to use these principles in our school on a daily basis?
Absolutely. Yes. Definitely. When we get to, I don't know where that particular slide is at the moment. But when we get to the next workshop, it's going to be on the standards and the resources. So that is, those are student facing standards, just like they're a counterpoint to the Southern Poverty Law Center so-called social justice standards, which are basically identity politics into standards, critical social justice ideology. So this is an alternative to that for those who would like to engage with an alternative. And there should be choice in terms of this topic in particular. So hopefully that's helpful to people.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lee. It looks like it is 1:59 right now, so I think we've pretty much, I want to be respectful for everybody's time here, and I think we've come to the end of our presentation here today.
Okay. Awesome. All right. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Rob, for your moderation. Always appreciated when there's a million things happening. And hope to see you at the next workshop, and we'll talk soon, and bye for now.